Housing affordability has sunk to its lowest level in 3 decades.
Here and today's inflation figures could spell trouble for millions.
Terrible news for hard-working Australians.
Everybody, of course, is talking about the cost of living crisis, but let's be clear, different people are experiencing this.
An urgent call tonight to help those in poverty as new figures reveal a soaring number of Australians living below the line.
Cost of living out here in Australia is crazy. Let me show you.
Something's happening across Australia that most people haven't noticed yet. The cafe you've walked past for 5 years has shutters down and a faded for lease sign in the window. Your neighbour mentioned they're relocating to Brisbane last week, and you realised 3 other families on your street have done the same in the past year. The local primary school just announced it's merging with another because enrolment dropped below viability. These aren't random events. They're warning signals of a much larger crisis unfolding in real time. Entire Australian cities are experiencing slow-motion collapse. Population charts show gentle downward slopes. Government reports use words like stabilising and transitioning. Meanwhile, property listings multiply without buyers, job seekers outnumber positions, and young professionals plan their exit strategies before they even finish university. The pattern is clear. Jobs that once anchored communities have vanished or degraded into casual contracts offering no security. Housing markets have decoupled completely from local wages, pricing out everyone except wealthy outsiders. Critical infrastructure continues deteriorating, while governments delay repairs they can never afford. In some regions, climate disasters strike repeatedly before communities can even begin recovering. 7 Australian cities are already past the early warning stage. These aren't predictions. The decline is measurable, documented, and accelerating. We're counting down from number 7 to number 1. From cities showing serious symptoms to the one already approaching the point where recovery becomes impossible. City number 7, Adelaide. The quiet decline. Adelaide is Australia's 5th largest city with 1.4 million people, and it's already falling behind. The decline is almost invisible because it's happening so gradually, which makes it far more dangerous than a sudden crash. When nobody's watching, nobody intervenes. Last year, Adelaide's population grew by just 1.5%, the second slowest of any capital city. Perth grew over 3.1%. Melbourne and Brisbane passed 2.7%. Sydney hit 2.0%. Adelaide isn't keeping pace, and the gap isn't closing, it's widening. Here's the critical detail. Australians are leaving. Net overseas migration is the only thing stopping population decline. Internal migration is negative. More locals move out than move in. So what broke? The jobs that built Adelaide's middle class are gone. When Holden shut its Elizabeth plant in 2017, 950 direct jobs disappeared. Across the supply chain, another 2,000 to 6,000 jobs followed. These weren't just jobs. They were stable, well-paid roles that supported families for generations. Today, nearly 1 in 5 South Australian households struggle financially, the second highest rate in the country. Yes, Adelaide is cheaper than Sydney or Melbourne, roughly 10 to 14% lower. But affordability collapses when wages fall too. Here's the part most people miss. This isn't new. Since 2010, Adelaide's population forecasts have been revised downward again and again, because reality keeps undershooting the plan. The economy has grown, employment is up, unemployment is low, and still, people aren't coming. The government points to the future. Submarines, hydrogen, renewables. They project 670,000 new residents by 2050. But hitting that target requires 315,000 new homes and 254,000 new jobs. Right now, Adelaide isn't building either fast enough. Cities don't suddenly fail. The process begins with economic stagnation, continues with demographic aging, then reaches a tipping point where growth simply stops. Adelaide doesn't need to lose people to be in trouble. It only needs to stop attracting the young. And if Adelaide shows how decline begins quietly, the next city shows what happens when an entire industry abandons you. City number 6, Wollongong, the Rust Belt reality. Wollongong sits 80 kilometers south of Sydney with around 300,000 people, and it's watching its economic foundation crumble in real time. This city was built on steel, For generations, BlueScope Steel and Port Kembla Steelworks provided thousands of jobs that anchored entire communities. But that anchor is corroding. Between 2011 and 2016, Wollongong lost over 1,000 manufacturing jobs. The city's unemployment rate sits consistently above the national average. Young people leave because the careers their parents had simply don't exist anymore. What's killing Wollongong isn't just deindustrialisation. It's being crushed between two impossible forces. Sydney housing refugees flee south seeking affordability, driving Wollongong property prices and rents far beyond what local manufacturing wages can support. The median house price climbed past $900,000 by 2024, completely disconnected from regional earning capacity. Meanwhile, workers displaced from vanishing industrial jobs find themselves competing for housing against cashed-up Sydney buyers who can afford to outbid them by hundreds of thousands. The mathematics become impossible. Local wages designed for a manufacturing economy trying to compete in a housing market priced for Sydney professional salaries. The city lacks sufficient emergency services and infrastructure for its growing population. Specialist homelessness services turn away dozens daily. Street sleeping increased throughout 2024, with rough sleepers visible in parks and along beaches, a phenomenon that would have been unthinkable in Wollongong's industrial heyday. Wollongong exemplifies regional city collapse under metropolitan overflow pressure. It's being squeezed from both sides, losing its industrial base while simultaneously absorbing Sydney's housing crisis without any of the wage growth that might make those prices sustainable. The formula is clear. When industrial jobs vanish while metropolitan housing refugees simultaneously drive prices beyond local wage capacity, and wage stagnation prevents any catch-up, decline accelerates exponentially. If Wollongong shows what happens when your economic foundation disappears while housing costs soar, the next city reveals what occurs when geographic isolation prevents anyone from putting down roots. City number 5. Darwin, the temporary city. Darwin isn't failing economically. It's failing socially because nobody stays long enough to build a life. Around 150,000 people live in this remote capital city, and the Northern Territory exchanges a fifth of its population every year. 1 in 5 people cycling in and out every single year. Darwin isn't a city people move to, it's a city people pass through. Darwin had 32 straight quarters of negative internal migration leading up to COVID. That's 8 years of more people leaving than arriving from the rest of Australia. The city imports workers, uses them up, then they leave. A city doesn't need to lose people to be in trouble. When nobody stays, nothing lasts. Research found Darwin's biggest problem isn't jobs. It's that people who come for jobs don't stay. Young workers arrive in their 20s. Most leave by their mid-30s or early 40s. Why? Heat is a massive factor. About 2/3 of Darwin residents say they plan to leave at some point. For people over 50, extreme heat is a major driver. For those over 70, it's the most important reason. But it's not just the weather. Darwin has one of the highest employment turnover rates in Australia. The Northern Territory government struggles to fill positions. Overseas migration keeps the city alive, but it's mostly temporary workers who will eventually leave too. Services suffer because there's no continuity. Skills drain away, communities never fully form. What makes Darwin's situation truly catastrophic is something few outsiders understand. Darwin's economy runs on boom-bust cycles that destroy wealth. During the resources boom around 2010-2014, median house prices hit $650,000. Then, as major LNG construction projects finished and workers left, prices crashed to $450,000 to $500,000. That's a 30% decline, wiping out equity for anyone who bought near the peak. Think about that. You work in Darwin's brutal heat, you save for a home, you buy at the peak, then your job ends. You have to leave, and you sell at a massive loss. No matter how many jobs appear on paper, Darwin can't grow because nobody stays long enough to turn work into a life. But if Darwin shows what happens when a place can never become home, the next city shows what happens when tourism becomes your only lifeline. and that lifeline starts fraying. City number 4. Cairns, the one industry trap. Cairns has 178,000 people living in tropical paradise, and that's exactly the problem. When your entire economy depends on tourists showing up, you're one crisis away from collapse. Tourism accounts for over 60% of Cairns' economy. International visitor numbers crashed 43.4% from 2019 levels. Visitors dropped 9.5% to 2.3 million, and these visitors shortened their stays by 0.6 nights to 5.1 nights average. The mathematics are brutal. When visitor numbers drop while average stays shorten and per visitor spending decreases, the compounding effect creates economic devastation. Japanese visitors, once a cornerstone market, plummeted 40.5% to just 67,000. Virgin Airlines withdrew flights to Japan in 2024, severing a critical route. The Japanese yen-Australian dollar exchange rate makes Australia prohibitively expensive for Japanese tourists. Here's what people don't understand about tourism dependency. When tourism thrives, property prices soar beyond what service workers can afford. When tourism crashes, those inflated prices don't adjust fast enough. You get trapped in the worst scenario, high costs with low income. Cairns workers earn service industry wages while competing for housing against cashed-up Brisbane and Sydney refugees seeking tropical lifestyle changes. Median rent for a one-bedroom unit exceeds $400 weekly. Retail and hospitality workers earning $25 hourly take home roughly $800 weekly, after tax. Half disappears to rent before food or transport. The existential threat nobody wants to acknowledge. Climate change threatens Cairns' primary tourist attraction, the Great Barrier Reef. Coral bleaching events accelerate. Each bleaching reduces the reef's appeal. As the reef dies, so does Cairns' economic foundation. The city faces impossible mathematics. When your economy depends almost entirely on tourism, while climate change threatens your main attraction and workers can't afford local housing costs, the future becomes unsustainable. Seasonal employment means workers arrive for summer jobs facing astronomical accommodation costs, then face unemployment for months. Many live in cars or camp illegally in beachside reserves. This is the collapse formula. When a city depends on a single industry while facing existential climate threats and workers can't afford to live where they work, the entire system becomes unsustainable. But if Cairns shows what happens when tourism falters, the next city shows what happens when the future generation simply disappears. City number 3. Launceston, the city young people escape from. If you're 18 in Launceston, your future probably isn't there, and almost everyone knows it. Launceston in northern Tasmania recorded the largest population decline of any local government area in Australia last year. 261 people left. That might not sound like much, but in a city of just over 71,000, it's a warning sign that something is fundamentally broken. School enrollments tell the real story. One resident said his kid's school lost 30-40 students in 2 years. Schools in other parts of Launceston lost more than 100 students. Every student who leaves takes future businesses, families, and tax revenue with them. A city can survive losing people. It can't survive losing its next generation. But this is where the story gets ugly. Launceston hasn't just declined once. It's been trending down on and off for years. The city's average growth rate over the past decade sits at 0.05%. Tasmania as a whole has the lowest population growth in the country, 8 times lower than the national average. Research by workforce demographer Dr. Lisa Denny found the #1 reason Tasmanians leave is the lack of secure, full-time, well-paid work. Launceston has higher unemployment than both Tasmania and Australia as a whole. A plane load of young people leaves Tasmania every week, most of them from cities like Launceston. Once young people leave in large numbers, they almost never come back. The city's also aging fast. Natural population decline is setting in, more deaths than births. The workforce is shrinking while the tax base simultaneously erodes. Launceston has a small, relatively isolated economy based on agriculture, manufacturing, healthcare, and tourism. There's limited economic diversity and limited scale to absorb shocks. When agricultural processing or key local employers face difficulties, there simply aren't many alternatives for displaced workers. Economic stress triggers population decline, which reduces demand for housing and services, which causes more economic contraction. For a small city like this, that spiral is difficult to reverse once it starts. This is the collapse formula. When employment opportunities remain scarce while young people flee in massive numbers and geographic isolation prevents replacement migration, the downward spiral becomes nearly impossible to reverse. But if Launceston shows what happens when the future generation disappears, the next city shows what happens when families get financially destroyed just trying to stay. City number 2. Hobart, eaten alive by its own boom. Picture this. You grow up in Hobart, secure what locals consider a decent job, save diligently for years, and you still can't afford to buy a home in your own city. That's not a future scenario. That's Hobart right now. Hobart added less than 1,000 people last year, the slowest growth of any Australian capital by a long shot. But here's the twist. Parts of the city are actually losing people. Hobart Inner and Hobart Northwest both recorded population declines in 2024, the first time that's happened outside of COVID lockdowns. Hobart isn't shrinking yet, it's pricing out its future. Around 240,000 people live in this city that experienced one of Australia's most extreme property booms between 2016 and 2021. Median house prices increased by approximately 80 to 90% in just 5 years. Prices jumped from around $350,000 in 2016 to somewhere in the $650,000–700,000 range by 2021. The median house price in Inner Hobart hit over $1 million in 2021, nearly 13 times the median household income for the region. Think about that. Sydney gets called out for being expensive, but Hobart now has the highest housing costs per capita in Australia alongside Sydney. Same price, but Tasmanian wages are significantly lower. Hobart has the lowest rental vacancy rate and the least diverse housing stock of any capital. Only 10% of homes are flats or apartments, the rest standalone houses. Which means if you can't afford a full house, you're basically priced out. The ticking time bomb that's about to detonate. Many people who bought at the peak in 2021 or 2022 locked in low fixed rates of 2 to 3%. As those fixed rates expire through 2024 and 2025, mortgage payments are jumping by $500 to $1,000 per month or more for these borrowers. This isn't a hypothetical risk. The reset is already happening, and it's hitting people who bought thinking Hobart was safe. Interest rates now sit at 4.35% and will likely stay elevated for the foreseeable future, which makes the market vulnerable to a significant correction that could wipe out recent gains. Families can't afford to stay as the workforce ages and the city becomes progressively unlivable for anyone who isn't already wealthy. Tasmania spends the least per capita on public transport in Australia. Weekday usage dropped by 80% between 1964 and 2021. If you don't own a car in Hobart, you're stuck. The combination of skyrocketing costs, stagnant wages, and deteriorating infrastructure creates an impossible living situation. For anyone who bought property in Hobart at the peak, a recession could mean significant negative equity. Some economists have suggested vulnerable markets could see declines of 20–30% in worst-case scenarios. This isn't a prediction, it's a vulnerability. For a market that rose 80 to 90%, that kind of correction is mathematically possible and would devastate recent buyers. This is the collapse formula. When property prices surge rapidly while local wages remain suppressed and housing stock diversity stays extremely limited, a market correction becomes inevitable and devastating. Up until now, these cities still technically exist as functioning places. The next one shows what happens when a city doesn't just decline, it disappears. City number 1, Lismore, erased by forces beyond control. What happens when your city floods, your insurance company says no, and the government buyback doesn't cover your street? You're trapped. And that's exactly what's happening in Lismore. Lismore in northern New South Wales recorded one of the largest population declines in the country between 2022 and 2024. At least 566 people left between June 2022 and June 2023 alone. The number's likely higher now. This wasn't the slow erosion other cities experience. Catastrophic flooding in 2022 destroyed an entire community in just a matter of days. Water went over roofs of houses that had never flooded in 50 years, destroying everything. 4 people died while thousands were displaced. And here's the part that changes everything. Most of them never came back. 2/3 of households surveyed on the Lismore floodplain don't have flood insurance. Why? They can't afford it. Some tried to get insurance after repairs but were refused because of their location. Around 1,200 homes could be completely financially exposed to the next major flood. These people returned to damaged houses because they had no choice, but they're living on borrowed time. The government's buyback program only covers some properties. Many residents have fallen through the cracks. Uninsured or underinsured, houses half repaired, no financial help available. The financial prison nobody talks about. Imagine owning a home that insurance companies refuse to cover, that buyers refuse to purchase, and that you lack the financial resources to repair properly, all in a city that will almost certainly flood again. That's not home ownership, that's financial captivity. The community is traumatized while schools have lost hundreds of students and businesses continue shutting down permanently. Residents are still dealing with mental and physical health conditions from the disaster. Lismore was already vulnerable before the flood. High rates of unemployment, people over 65, and those living with disabilities. The flood just accelerated what was already happening, the slow unraveling of a community. Cities don't recover from this. They hollow out as essential services depart and property values crater, leaving behind only a shell of what once was. Lismore isn't experiencing the slow decline other cities face. It's being systematically erased through repeated flooding, one family departure at a time. The uncomfortable truth. 7 Australian cities, each facing fundamentally different problems, all arriving at the same devastating result. Lismore was destroyed by climate and left to rebuild alone. Hobart is pricing out its future with million-dollar homes and minimum wage jobs. Launceston is bleeding young people who see no future there. Cairns depends entirely on an industry threatened by the very climate change destroying its main attraction. Darwin is stuck in a cycle where jobs don't create community. Wollongong lost its industrial heart and can't afford the Sydney overflow. Adelaide's falling further behind as other capitals accelerate. The pattern is clear. When housing costs rise faster than wages, when job security disappears, when infrastructure fails, when climate risks aren't addressed, people leave. And once that starts, it's hard to reverse. Here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to answer. How many more cities are just one crisis away from the same fate? Because collapse doesn't remain contained, it spreads to neighboring regions, creating cascading failures across entire economic zones. If this changed how you think about Australia's future, subscribe for more stories like this that most people are too afraid to talk about.